On a clear winter morning in 1986, millions watched with pride as a white shuttle pierced the Florida sky. 73 seconds later, it vanished in fire. A teacher, 6 astronauts, a nation's dream, all gone in an instant. Families gasped, children screamed, and mission control fell silent. How could the machine built to carry humanity's hopes shatter before the world's eyes? Behind that explosion lay ignored warnings, hidden flaws, and choices that sealed the fate of Challenger. This is not just the story of a launch. It is the story of a mission gone tragically wrong. In the wake of Apollo, America stood at a crossroads. The moon had been reached, flags had been planted, and history had been made. Yet in the silence that followed, a question lingered. What next? The nation had proven it could conquer space, but could it make space part of everyday life? Out of that vision came the shuttle program, a new era where rockets would no longer be one-time wonders, but reusable vehicles, lifting off like airplanes and returning again and again. It was a bold promise, and no ship carried it more visibly than Challenger. From the moment Challenger first rolled out, it looked different from the expendable rockets of the past. Sleek, winged, wrapped in gleaming white tiles, it symbolized continuity with Apollo's triumphs while pointing toward a more practical future. For NASA, the shuttle was meant to transform spaceflight from rare spectacle into routine transportation. The public was told these ships would fly every week, carrying satellites, experiments, and eventually people beyond the reach of Earth's gravity at a fraction of Apollo's cost. Challenger quickly became a workhorse. Its first flight in 1983 hailed as a milestone in engineering progress. The early missions felt triumphant. Astronauts deployed satellites, conducted experiments, and brought back images that seemed to promise a limitless horizon. Challenger's crews smiled for the cameras, reflecting the confidence of a nation convinced it was stepping into a new technological age. For schoolchildren who had missed Apollo, the shuttle became their space age. It was no longer just the story of daring test pilots. It was the story of teachers, scientists, even ordinary citizens who might one day ride into orbit. Challenger embodied that hope. But beneath the spectacle, tension was growing. The shuttle program was expensive, complex, and far from routine. Still, the dream held powerful sway. Speeches proclaimed that America's future lay in the stars. Engineers worked tirelessly to make the dream a reality, believing the shuttle could become as common as an airliner. In living rooms across the country, families gathered around their televisions, inspired by the idea that space was no longer distant or abstract. It was within reach. At its heart, Challenger was not just a machine of steel and fuel. It was a vessel for human ambition, a reminder that progress often begins with daring. For NASA, it was proof that the United States could lead the world not just in exploration, but in turning space into a frontier for all. That was the promise, bold, inspiring, almost unstoppable. Yet promises have weight, and expectations have cost. Even in its earliest flights, Challenger carried more than satellites. It carried national pride, political momentum, and the fragile trust of the American people. And as the shuttle soared, unseen cracks began to form in the vision that lifted it skyward. The sky, it seemed, was opening wide for humanity. But how strong was the vessel that carried those dreams? The shuttle was never just another rocket. It was born from a dream that engineers had wrestled with for decades. How to build a spacecraft that could return to Earth, be refurbished, and fly again. In theory, it would slash the cost of space exploration. In practice, it demanded a design unlike anything attempted before, a hybrid of rocket, glider, and spacecraft. NASA's vision was clear. A fleet of orbiters, each one capable of flying dozens, even hundreds of times. Where Apollo capsules had burned away in re-entry, the shuttle would glide home on wings. Where Saturn rockets had been discarded after each launch, the shuttle's solid boosters would parachute into the ocean, to be hauled back and reused. It was not simply a machine, it was a philosophy. Space would no longer be an extraordinary event, but a reliable service. Challenger's birth reflected that ambition. Constructed at Rockwell International's plant in California, it emerged from assembly lines where technology and hope intertwined. Engineers pieced together thousands of heat-resistant tiles, each hand-fitted like scales on a dragon. Its solid rocket boosters stood taller than skyscrapers, their segments bolted together with massive steel joints. And at its heart sat the external tank, painted bright orange, a reservoir of liquid fuel so vast it dwarfed anything that had come before. When Challenger rolled onto the launch pad for the first time, it was greeted like a promise fulfilled. Reporters hailed it as a symbol of efficiency. Officials spoke of cheaper flights, faster schedules, and a new space age. The shuttle was said to be as routine as an airplane, ready to carry satellites for business, defense, and science at a moment's notice. But behind the optimism, the truth was more complicated. The shuttle was not cheap. Each launch consumed billions in preparation, refurbishment, and logistics. Engineers knew the design carried risks, compromises made under political and budgetary pressures. The boosters, designed in segmented pieces for transport convenience, required O-rings to seal them. Those O-rings were never meant to be pushed beyond certain temperatures. Yet with each flight, the machine worked and confidence grew. Still, to the public, Challenger was flawless. The shuttle was visible proof that spaceflight had evolved. Children drew pictures of it in school. Teachers built lessons around its missions. News anchors spoke of it as if it were indestructible. Challenger itself became a household name. From the lab to the launch pad, the shuttle represented something larger than science. It embodied a nation's will to reach beyond Earth, even when obstacles loomed. Each launch seemed to whisper, "The future is here, and it is reusable." But the shuttle was also a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, carries limits. Its flawless appearance concealed hidden vulnerabilities. The nation saw a machine of perfection. Engineers saw a system held together by compromise. And as Challenger's fame spread, a new chapter was about to begin. One that brought spaceflight closer to everyday life than ever before. By the mid-1980s, the shuttle was more than just a scientific tool. It had become a stage for America's imagination. NASA wanted to inspire, to prove that space wasn't reserved for test pilots and elite astronauts. It wanted ordinary citizens to see themselves in the stars. Out of that vision came the Teacher in Space program, and at its heart was Christa McAuliffe. Christa wasn't a scientist or military pilot. She was a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. When she applied, it was with little expectation. More than 11,000 citizens submitted applications. Yet Christa's warmth, humor, and passion for teaching set her apart. When she was chosen in 1985, the nation embraced her as its spacefaring teacher. She was to bring lessons from orbit back to Earth, teaching students live from space. It was a bold idea, turning a shuttle flight into the largest classroom in history. Her family, her husband Stephen, her 2 children, her parents, became part of the story. Interviews captured their pride and quiet anxiety. Christa herself spoke of the chance not as a risk, but as a gift. She said she wanted to represent teachers everywhere, to remind students that history was something they could live, not just read. Her smile became a symbol of hope, her presence proof that space belonged to everyone. NASA leaned into the story. News outlets covered her training with fascination. Christa in the simulator, Christa in her blue flight suit, Christa joking with the crew. For school children, she was instantly relatable. Here was someone who looked like their own teacher, preparing to ride the shuttle into the heavens. Across the country, classrooms prepared to watch her lessons. Challenger's next mission wasn't just another flight. It was a cultural event. Yet not everyone inside NASA shared the public's excitement. Some engineers worried that the shuttle program was stretching itself too thin. Too many launches, too many promises, too many expectations. But in the public eye, none of that mattered. Christa's presence gave Challenger a glow of human warmth that no technical report could dim. She transformed a launch into a moment of national celebration. Her crewmates, too, welcomed her energy. The Challenger crew, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe became more than names on a flight roster. They were a diverse group of veterans, scientists, and specialists bound together by a shared mission. Christa was the newcomer, but her enthusiasm helped bind them. In press conferences, they teased one another, laughing together like family. In January 1986, as Challenger stood poised on its launch pad, the eyes of a nation were on this one crew. Millions of students waited eagerly for the first lesson from orbit. For the first time, children across America felt they had a direct connection to space. But the dream of a teacher in space carried a hidden weight. The world was not only watching Challenger, it was trusting it. And that trust would soon be tested in the most tragic way imaginable. Challenger looked strong, solid boosters towering beside its orange fuel tank, white wings gleaming in the Florida sun. But inside the system, fragility lurked. The shuttle was a machine of compromises, born not only from engineering brilliance, but also from political bargaining. Every bolt, every joint, every material had been weighed against budgets, deadlines, and congressional approval. At the heart of this fragile design lay the solid rocket boosters, the largest ever built. They were not single pieces of steel but segmented cylinders, manufactured in Utah and shipped cross-country. To join the segments, engineers used massive steel rings sealed with rubber O-rings, flexible gaskets meant to keep superheated gases inside during ignition. On paper, it worked. In practice, it carried risk. Some engineers raised alarms early. The O-rings were vulnerable to erosion, tiny gaps where heat could eat through rubber and threaten the steel beneath. Reports showed burn marks from previous flights. Yet each time the shuttle survived. Flights continued, and the warnings began to sound less urgent to those outside engineering circles. In NASA's culture, success often dulled the sting of risk. The shuttle's very design was a tightrope. It was expected to do everything: carry heavy satellites for defense, run science experiments, even host civilians like Christa McAuliffe. To meet these goals, engineers bent the limits of what was possible. The orbiter's heat shield, made of thousands of delicate tiles, had to withstand re-entry temperatures hotter than molten lava. Its main engines had to run at pressures higher than anything in rocket history. And still, it was supposed to be reusable. Inside NASA, people knew the truth. The shuttle was not routine, not simple, and certainly not indestructible. Each launch was an intricate gamble. Yet the public narrative insisted otherwise. Officials described the shuttle as operational, like a tested airliner, when in reality it was still experimental. One of Challenger's engineers later described it bluntly. It was like riding a bomb. That was not exaggeration. 2 million parts had to function perfectly in harmony. A single failure could unravel the mission. The booster joints, especially those O-rings, became symbols of that fragility. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible, wrote memo after memo about the risks. They documented erosion, pressed managers to pay attention. Some begged NASA to reconsider its aggressive schedule until the flaw could be addressed. But Challenger kept flying. And with each successful landing, the danger seemed less urgent, more distant, until inevitably it would no longer be ignored. The shuttle carried the dream of routine spaceflight. But in its very bones, it carried weakness. Weakness that would one day meet the wrong conditions at the wrong time, with devastating results. The question was not whether Challenger's flaws existed. It was how long the dream could outrun the machine's limits. Long before Challenger's final flight, the shuttle's armor had already been pierced. Engineers had seen it, written about it, even spoken up, but their words echoed faintly against the roar of progress. The O-rings, small circles of rubber buried deep in the booster's joints, had already shown signs of failure. Blackened soot and scorched rubber appeared after several missions. In some cases, the primary O-ring was nearly eaten through, leaving only the secondary ring as the last barrier between fire and catastrophe. Each incident was written into post-flight reports. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the boosters, sent warnings. But to NASA managers, The shuttle's continued survival seemed proof enough of safety. They called it acceptable risk. Each flight without disaster became its own reassurance, even though the evidence suggested the system was living on borrowed time. It wasn't only the boosters. The shuttle's heat shield tiles, thousands of fragile ceramic blocks glued to the orbiter's skin, were prone to falling off. The main engines, running hotter than any engine before them, required constant repair. And yet the pressure to keep flying never eased. Deadlines loomed, satellites waited, and politicians demanded results. The cracks were not just mechanical, they were cultural. NASA had become trapped in its own legend. This was the agency that had landed men on the moon, that had performed the impossible before the world's eyes. To admit vulnerability now, in the age of the shuttle, felt unthinkable. Pride hardened into blindness. Some voices refused to quiet. Engineers like Roger Boisterly of Morton Thiokol wrote urgent memos about the O-rings, warning that cold weather could stiffen the rubber and make it fail completely. His words carried an eerie certainty. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. But the shuttle program moved forward. Each successful mission seemed to silence the warnings a little more. Within NASA, the term normalization of deviance began to describe the culture. Repeated exposure to flaws without disaster made the flaws seem less threatening. Managers accepted them, even rationalized them, as part of doing business. The armor was cracking, and not just in the boosters or tiles. It was cracking in the very mindset that judged danger. For Challenger, the danger was not theoretical. The evidence was written in burn marks in charred rubber, in warnings that piled up like unread letters. The shuttle was not failing silently. It was speaking through data, through engineers, through its own scars. But in the rush to meet schedules and expectations, those voices were muffled. The shuttle kept flying. The dream kept shining. And the cracks in the armor widened, waiting for the day when they would no longer be ignored. By 1986, the shuttle was no longer just a spacecraft. It was a promise under contract. NASA had pledged dozens of flights each year, a tempo so ambitious it bordered on impossible. Satellites worth billions sat in warehouses, waiting for shuttle delivery. The Pentagon had military payloads in line. Schools across America counted down to Christa McAuliffe's lessons from orbit. And television networks stood ready to broadcast every second. The shuttle program had become entangled in politics. Presidents used it as a symbol of American strength. Congress measured it as a return on investment. Every delay meant embarrassment, lost money, and headlines questioning whether NASA had lost its edge. Inside Mission Control, deadlines loomed like storm clouds. The dream of routine access to space had hardened into obligation. NASA managers, under pressure, began to make decisions less like explorers and more like businessmen. They needed the shuttle to fly on time, even when conditions weren't ideal. They stretched the definition of safe, brushing aside warnings, telling themselves that risk was part of progress. What had once been experimental test flights were now treated as routine transportation. Challenger's mission, STS-51L, was particularly burdened. It had already been delayed several times, by weather, by technical glitches, by scheduling conflicts. Each delay added frustration and political pressure. News outlets mocked NASA's constant rescheduling. Teachers across the nation had prepared classrooms to tune in. The White House, eager for a dramatic moment of inspiration, expected Christa McAuliffe's flight to succeed. The launch had become more than a mission. It was a spectacle the country had been promised. For the astronauts, the pressure filtered down in subtle ways. They trained tirelessly, aware of the attention their flight carried. Yet behind the smiles and jokes at press conferences, they understood that delays were frustrating powerful people. The expectation to launch was inescapable. Meanwhile, engineers like Roger Boisterly and his colleagues at Morton Thiokol struggled to be heard. They sent memos, raised alarms, and urged caution. But to slow the program meant disappointing not just NASA, but the nation itself. Warnings were weighed against politics, against pride, against the desire to keep America's space program untouchable in the eyes of the world. This was the paradox of Challenger. The very program built to inspire had become shackled to deadlines and appearances. The shuttle was expected to be flawless and frequent, all while carrying risks hidden deep within its design. It was a machine of steel and fuel, but also of expectations. Expectations that pressed harder than any launch countdown. The launch date of January 28, 1986, was fixed not only by the clock but by politics, by television schedules, by the collective anticipation of millions. The shuttle had to fly. That pressure left little room for hesitation. And as Challenger sat waiting on the pad, the nation held its breath, unaware that behind the frozen Florida air, history's most tragic countdown was about to begin. The night before Challenger's launch, Cape Canaveral did not feel like Florida. A bitter cold front swept across the state, plunging temperatures to levels unseen in years. By dawn, ice coated the launch tower, icicles hung from railings, and frost clung to the massive orange tank. The shuttle looked less like a machine of fire and flight, and more like a frozen monument. For the engineers at Morton Thiokol, this was the nightmare they had feared. The rubber O-rings that sealed the booster joints were never designed to withstand such cold. At low temperatures, the rubber lost its flexibility, taking precious seconds longer to seal under pressure. In those seconds, superheated gases could escape. The data was clear, and the risk was enormous. On the eve of launch, Thiokol engineers gathered in tense meetings with NASA managers. Roger Boisterly and others pleaded with their superiors, do not launch. They presented charts, graphs, and urgent warnings that cold weather could cause catastrophic failure. They knew the consequences were not abstract, they could mean the lives of 7 people. For hours, the debate raged. Engineers pressed for caution. But NASA managers, under the crushing weight of schedule and expectation, pushed back. They argued the data was inconclusive, that past flights had flown with some erosion and survived. Pressure from above weighed heavily. In the end, the recommendation to delay was reversed. Against their better judgment, Thiokol executives caved. The final decision was made: Challenger would fly. At the launch site, workers battled the freeze. Cameras caught sight of ice glittering on the shuttle's frame. Yet in the viewing stands, families and school children huddled under blankets, waiting with excitement. Christa McAuliffe's parents sat among them, beaming with pride, unaware of the storm of warnings that had unfolded behind closed doors the night before. As dawn gave way to morning, Challenger stood ready. Engineers carried the burden of what they knew, powerless now to stop what had been set in motion. For them, every glint of ice was not just a sign of cold, it was a sign of danger. The Florida freeze had turned the shuttle into a test it was never meant to face. The O-rings were stiff, brittle, and vulnerable. The countdown clock ticked forward, indifferent to the warnings, indifferent to the cold. Millions tuned in on television, classrooms across America buzzing with anticipation. To the nation, this was the beginning of a new chapter in exploration. To the engineers who had spoken out, it was the edge of a precipice. The question was no longer whether Challenger could inspire. It was whether Challenger could survive the sky it was about to enter. The morning of January 28, 1986, began with hesitation. At the Kennedy Space Center, technicians reported the thick ice clinging to the launch tower. NASA's ice team inspected the pad, photographing icicles longer than a man's arm, noting frost creeping along critical surfaces. Some voiced concern that chunks of ice could break loose at liftoff, striking the orbiter's delicate heat tiles. Yet after hours of inspection, managers declared the risk acceptable. The launch clock resumed. In the background lingered the more urgent danger, the O-rings. Morton Thiokol's engineers had issued their warnings, begged for delay, even written the word catastrophic in memos. But the executives, under pressure, had given NASA the green light. That green light became official policy. And once the momentum of a launch day gathered, reversing it became nearly impossible. Inside Mission Control, the mood was calm but taut. Consoles glowed, voices checked systems, and controllers reported all clear. The crew, suited and strapped in, exchanged jokes over the intercom. Commander Francis Scobie spoke with steady assurance. Christa McAuliffe, her excitement barely contained, smiled behind her helmet. To them, the morning delays were part of the process, nothing unusual. At 11:30 a.m., final polls began. Each flight director responded in turn. Go. Weather was cold but clear. Systems were ready. No voice spoke dissent. The launch director gave the call. Challenger, you are go for launch. The phrase carried weight beyond the technical. It meant the choice had been made. The shuttle would rise. 7 lives would leave the Earth depending on every gasket, every joint, every piece of machinery holding together under strain. Spectators shivered in the bleachers, unaware of the meetings, the memos, the private doubts. For them, the go-ahead was a thrill. Teachers encouraged students to focus on the television screens. Parents hugged children closer as the countdown began to tick. In the final moments, the scene was strangely calm. Steam billowed from the fuel tank, curling into the cold air. Birds scattered as the engines roared to life in test bursts. The orbiter vibrated, straining against the pad as though impatient to leap skyward. The astronauts braced for the moment. Training had taught them every motion, every command. Yet no rehearsal could capture the raw force that was seconds away. At T-10, the world seemed to hold its breath. The countdown voice droned steadily, 9, 8, 7. At 6, the main engines thundered to life, flames churning beneath the pad. At 3, the shuttle shuddered, restrained by clamps. At 0, the solid boosters ignited with a blinding flash. Challenger broke free. It climbed, white smoke billowing, the crowd erupting in cheers. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect, the ship alive, the dream intact. But within that rising fire, unseen by any watching eye, the decision to launch had already sealed the crew's fate. On launch mornings, astronauts often move like ghosts, visible, smiling, waving, but already halfway separated from the world they leave behind. For Challenger's crew, January 28th was no different. Hours before sunrise, they suited up in the astronaut quarters, assisted by technicians who checked every buckle, every seal. Cameras captured their grins. Francis Scobie's calm command presence, Michael Smith's steady gaze, Judith Resnick's quiet poise, Ellison Onizuka's easy smile, Ronald McNair's playful charm, Gregory Jarvis's excitement, and Christa McAuliffe's radiant joy. Then came the walk. Through narrow hallways, down elevators, across the open gantry, they waved to waiting onlookers. The Astrovan carried them slowly across the grounds of Kennedy Space Center, floodlights illuminating their faces behind thick helmets. Reporters filmed, spectators cheered. For families watching nearby, the sight was bittersweet, a moment of immense pride shadowed by quiet fear. To the astronauts, this ritual was familiar. Each had walked this path before, except Christa. For her, every step was electric. This was not just a launch, it was the culmination of a dream. She had told her students that she would bring space back to the classroom. Now, she was minutes away from keeping that promise. Inside the white room at the top of the launch tower, the crew entered Challenger one by one, climbing into the cabin where they would sit shoulder to shoulder for the next several hours. The ritual was smooth, rehearsed, almost casual. They strapped in, checked microphones, adjusted gloves. To outside observers, it was a portrait of confidence. But to the astronauts, moments of silence carried their own weight. Every launch carried risk, and they knew it. Mission Commander Scobie's voice remained steady, reassuring his team as he had throughout training. Michael Smith, the pilot, quietly ran through checklists with calm precision. In the back, Christa marveled at the view of the pad, whispering about how surreal it felt. For her, this was more than a mission. It was history, alive beneath her fingertips. In the viewing stands, Christa's family huddled together, beaming with pride. Teachers across the nation had organized watch parties, classrooms filled with children sitting cross-legged on floors, eyes fixed on televisions. To them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime lesson about courage, science, and possibility. As the countdown ticked closer, the crew exchanged light banter. Resnick cracked a soft joke, McNair chuckled. Small, human gestures against the enormity of the moment. And then came silence, the kind of silence that fills cockpits before ignition, where even steady breaths feel amplified. The final walk was complete. The crew was strapped in, ready to ride fire and steel into the sky. No one in those last moments could know that for the world watching, these images, The smiles, the waves, the quiet anticipation would become haunting symbols. They were not just walking to a shuttle. They were walking into history. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger surged from the pad, a roaring column of fire lifting it into the cloudless Florida sky. Spectators erupted into cheers, children pointed skyward, and television anchors declared the launch a success. For the first seconds, it looked perfect, the shuttle climbing fast, the boosters leaving twin trails of smoke etched against the blue. Inside the cabin, the crew felt the crushing acceleration press them into their seats. Commander Francis Scobie called out calmly, guiding his team through the ascent. Michael Smith, the pilot, monitored instruments with practiced precision. Christa McAuliffe, wide-eyed, experienced the raw force of spaceflight for the first time. The shuttle rattled, strained, but this was normal, the violent ballet of launch. At 30 seconds, ground control confirmed. All engines are running. All systems go. Relief rippled through mission control. The shuttle was performing as expected. But outside, invisible to the naked eye, the cold stiffened O-rings in the right booster were already leaking flames. A thin jet of fire burned against the steel joint, searching for a way out. The weakness engineers had feared was now alive, seconds from catastrophe. At 58 seconds, Challenger passed through max Q, maximum aerodynamic pressure. The shuttle shook under the force, its frame tested to the limit. The leak in the booster widened, flames licking dangerously close to the massive external fuel tank. At 68 seconds, cameras captured a flicker, fire cutting into the side of the tank. Inside the cabin, the crew felt nothing unusual. They were climbing steadily, focused, calm. Mission Control's voices were steady too, calling out altitude and velocity. To the world, the shuttle was on its way. At 73 seconds, it ended. The booster flame punctured the external tank, igniting liquid hydrogen and oxygen in a furious explosion. Challenger disappeared in a white fireball, splitting into fragments that streaked across the sky. Spectators gasped, screams echoing from the viewing stands. Children cried as teachers tried to process what they were seeing. In Mission Control, disbelief hung in the air. Monitors filled with static, data streams cut off. Then the haunting call. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. For the crew, the exact moment remains uncertain. Evidence later showed the cabin separated intact, thrown into a long, deadly arc before crashing into the Atlantic. What they experienced in those final seconds may never be fully known. On the ground, silence replaced celebration. Families stared upward, their joy twisted into horror. Christa McAuliffe's parents clutched each other, unable to speak. In classrooms across America, children sat stunned, watching their teacher vanish in fire. 73 seconds. That was all it took to transform triumph into tragedy. For those on the ground, the moment of disaster arrived like a cruel trick of perception. At first, the crowd thought it was part of the show, an unusual cloud pattern, maybe a booster separation. The sky bloomed with smoke trails curling outward, white against blue. Parents cheered weakly, uncertain, while children clapped in confusion. Only seconds later did the truth begin to sink in. The shuttle was gone. In the viewing stands, Christa McAuliffe's family sat frozen. Her parents, Grace and Edward, had been so proud, waving just minutes earlier. Now they stared upward at the twisting contrails. Some in the audience whispered that the crew must still be safe, that the shuttle would glide back. Others began to sob, their cheers turning into silence. For school children across the nation, the horror unfolded live. Classrooms that had erupted in excitement just a minute before now sat in stunned quiet. Teachers, realizing what had happened, scrambled to comfort their students, torn between grief and the need to shield young minds from the full weight of tragedy. It was a collective trauma unlike anything seen before. Millions of children watching their first space hero consumed before their eyes. On the launch grounds, reporters scrambled, their voices cracking as they struggled to narrate. Some fell silent, unable to speak. Broadcasters hesitated, unsure if they were watching a survivable accident or a national catastrophe. The image on television, the branching trails of smoke, falling debris, became instantly iconic, burned into memory. In Mission Control, the disbelief was equally heavy. Rows of controllers stared at their screens, refusing to accept what they saw. The official language was clinical, restrained. "We have a major malfunction." No one dared say the words that everyone already knew. The shuttle was lost. Spectators craned their necks, eyes glued to the sky as fragments streaked downward, some tumbling into the Atlantic. The sound of the explosion had rolled across the coast, but it was the silence afterward that cut deepest. Families clutched each other, holding on to hope long after hope was gone. Even among astronauts' families, who knew the risks better than anyone, the devastation was profound. Many had seen launches before, had braced for danger, but nothing could prepare them for a disaster unfolding in plain sight. One astronaut's wife later said, "We knew instantly. It wasn't survivable, but our hearts still wanted to believe." The image of those smoke plumes haunted America. To many, it looked like a white Y in the sky, one trail splitting into chaos, a symbol of shattered dreams. It lingered for minutes, drifting slowly, as if the heavens themselves refused to erase what had happened. Those who looked up that day would never forget. The sky, once a place of promise, had become a graveyard in full view of the world. The roar of the boosters faded, and with it, the sound of celebration. What remained was silence, stunned, hollow, unbearable. In the viewing stands, thousands stood rooted to the ground, their cheers choked off mid-breath. Christa McAuliffe's parents clutched one another, their faces blank, unable to process what they had just seen. Teachers hugged children tightly, some trying to distract them, others weeping openly. The air was filled with shock, but no words could make sense of the smoke still twisting in the sky. In Mission Control, that silence was broken only by clipped, professional voices. Flight controllers locked the doors. It was a phrase that meant no one could leave, no one could speak to the press, until the data had been secured. Screens showed garbled numbers, consoles blinked red. But deep inside, every controller knew the truth. Challenger had not survived. Newsrooms scrambled. Anchors hesitated, their voices faltering as they searched for confirmation. Some spoke cautiously of an explosion. Others clung to the hope that the crew might have ejected, that rescue was still possible. But the images on screen, falling debris, a sky in ruins, left little doubt. The shuttle had not returned. For NASA officials, the weight of responsibility pressed instantly. They had invited the world to watch, to celebrate the teacher in space. Now they faced the unthinkable, 7 lives lost before millions of witnesses. In the press room, officials struggled to form sentences. One voice, trembling, repeated, "We have no indication that the crew survived." It was as close as they dared to come to admitting the truth. Across America, televisions flickered with disbelief. Families who had gathered for a joyful broadcast now sat in silence. Parents turned to children, unable to explain. Teachers who had prepared lessons from space instead confronted grief in their classrooms. The very audience NASA had most hoped to inspire, school children, became the first to experience collective loss. At the crash site, Coast Guard vessels raced toward the ocean, searching for debris, hoping against reason for survivors. Helicopters hovered over the waves, spotting fragments of booster, tank, and shuttle scattered across miles of Atlantic. Divers were dispatched, but hope was fading with every passing second. The silence that followed Challenger's destruction was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of disbelief, of mourning held in suspension. The kind that descends when reality is too immense to grasp. People stared upward, long after the smoke trails had thinned, as if the sky might somehow reverse itself. But the sky would not undo what it had shown. Challenger was gone. And as grief began to seep in, one question burned quietly beneath the silence. How could this happen, when so many had warned it could? For many, the face of Challenger's mission was Christa McAuliffe. She was not a career astronaut or a military pilot. She was a teacher, a mother, a neighbor, someone who represented the ordinary made extraordinary. When the shuttle vanished, it was her loss that pierced most deeply into American homes. In Concord, New Hampshire, Christa's students had gathered with pride to watch their teacher step into history. They had cheered as the shuttle climbed, their voices filling the school gymnasium. Then they saw the fireball. The cheers stopped. Teachers scrambled to turn off televisions, but not before children had glimpsed what no child was prepared to see: their teacher's dream ending in smoke above the sky. Christa's husband, Stephen, watched from the viewing stands, holding their daughter Caroline's hand. Her parents sat nearby, stunned and silent. The family had been promised safety, reassured that the risks were minimal, that this was history in the making. In a heartbeat, those reassurances shattered. What remained was grief, played out under the unblinking eyes of cameras. Across the nation, parents struggled with what to tell their children. How do you explain that a teacher who had promised to come back with stories and lessons would never return? Christa had spoken so often about inspiring her students, about showing them that ordinary people could make history. Now her absence taught a far harsher lesson: that dreams carry risks, and sometimes those risks take everything. Her students, stunned into silence, left the gymnasium in tears. One recalled later, "We didn't understand at first. We thought she would still come back somehow." The loss was incomprehensible. How could a teacher, a figure of safety and guidance, be taken in such a violent instant? For her fellow teachers, the grief cut both personally and professionally. They had celebrated Christa's selection as a chance for their profession to shine on the grandest stage. Now they faced classrooms full of children with questions that had no answers. The Teacher in Space program, once a beacon of hope, had become a symbol of fragility. Christa's crewmates, too, were remembered not just as astronauts but as friends. Yet in the public imagination, Christa's role carried a unique weight. She had bridged the gap between the heavens and the classroom. Her presence had made the mission relatable, tangible, almost personal to millions of children who had never dreamed of astronauts as people they could become. Now she was gone. The teacher who had promised to take her students with her into orbit had left them grounded, mourning. Her legacy, however, was not erased by fire. It lingered, in memories, in the faces of children who remembered her lessons, and in the enduring belief that education and exploration are bound together. But in those first days of grief, her loss was raw, overwhelming, and impossible to soften. Christa McAuliffe had been chosen to inspire. In her absence, she inspired still, though now through sorrow. When the smoke trails faded from the Florida sky, the long night of grief began. Challenger's destruction was not just an accident. It was a wound that reached into living rooms, classrooms, and hearts across America. Families who had gathered in joy spent the evening in silence, television screens replaying the explosion again and again. The image of the shuttle's fiery disintegration looped endlessly, as if the country could not look away from its own heartbreak. At NASA, shock hardened into sorrow. Engineers and flight directors remained sealed inside mission control, replaying data, staring at the numbers that stopped at T+73 seconds. Some sat with their heads in their hands. Others buried grief beneath the discipline of work. They had promised safety. Now 7 astronauts were gone. One controller later recalled, "It felt like a funeral, but without the bodies." In Washington, President Ronald Reagan prepared to deliver the State of the Union. Instead, he spoke to a grieving nation. His words carried into classrooms, homes, and offices. "The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave." The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and will continue to follow them. His address tried to steady the country, but beneath the eloquence was the raw truth. 7 lives had been lost in full view of the world. For the families of the crew, the night was unbearable. In private rooms, NASA staff and counselors broke the news formally, even though the families had already seen it unfold with their own eyes. There were no words to ease the devastation. Some clung to hope that perhaps an escape mechanism had saved the crew. Others knew instantly that the loss was final. In that collision between hope and reality, Silence spoke louder than comfort. The astronauts had been more than their mission patches. They were parents, children, siblings, friends. Ronald McNair was a gifted physicist who had fought against segregation to reach space. Judith Resnick, a brilliant engineer, had become only the second American woman in orbit. Ellison Onizuka carried the dreams of Japanese Americans who saw themselves in his achievement. Gregory Jarvis, though new to NASA, had waited patiently through delays to finally claim his seat. Each was mourned not as a symbol, but as a person. As night fell, vigils appeared spontaneously. Churches opened their doors. Communities lit candles. Children wrote letters, their small handwriting asking why. The grief was collective, yet deeply personal. Challenger's loss was not a headline to be read. It was a sorrow felt in the pit of the nation's stomach. That night seemed endless. The country that had watched the launch with excitement now lay restless, replaying the sight of a bright flame ending too soon. Sleep came slowly, if at all, weighed down by the knowledge that tomorrow would not bring the crew back. It was, in every sense, the longest night. In the days that followed Challenger's destruction, the United States slowed to a halt. Offices turned televisions toward news updates. Schools abandoned lesson plans to talk about grief. Newspapers carried only one story, their front pages filled with the haunting image of smoke splitting in the sky. A nation that had once looked to the shuttle as a symbol of progress now saw it as a reminder of fragility. Public mourning took on both intimate and ceremonial forms. Families left flowers at schools and community centers. Children sent drawings and letters to NASA, many addressed to Christa McAuliffe, notes that would never be read by their intended recipient. Churches filled with prayers, not just for the crew, but for a country that had witnessed tragedy in real time. At NASA headquarters, the American flag was lowered to half-staff. The same occurred at the White House, at military bases, and at schools across the country. Symbols of mourning rippled outward, binding communities together in shared sorrow. Funerals were held one by one, each carrying the weight of both personal loss and national grief. At Christa McAuliffe's service in New Hampshire, hundreds of teachers stood side by side, united in mourning for one of their own. At Ellison Onizuka's memorial, the pride of the Japanese-American community was matched by its heartbreak. Judith Resnick's service drew scientists, colleagues, and young women who had seen her as proof that they, too, could belong in space. The ceremonies carried a heavy silence, broken only by hymns, eulogies, and the sound of taps. They were moments of collective pause, where time seemed to stretch, where the ordinary rhythm of life bent to the weight of grief. President Reagan attended services, as did senior NASA officials. Their presence underscored the scale of the loss. Yet for many mourners, what mattered most were the faces in photographs, the smiles of the crew, frozen forever in time. The astronauts were not remembered as symbols of failure, but as people who carried the nation's dreams. Across the country, classrooms held their own rituals. Children lit candles, stood in moments of silence, or wrote poems for Christa. Teachers, still reeling from shock, guided their students gently, reminding them that the pursuit of knowledge always carried risk. For many students, Challenger became their first experience with national tragedy, an early lesson in grief and resilience. The pause extended beyond mourning. Space flights were suspended indefinitely. The shuttle fleet was grounded. America had entered a moment of reflection, caught between the desire to honor the fallen and the urgent need to understand what had gone wrong. The Challenger disaster was not just an event, it was a rupture in the nation's sense of progress. The country stopped, collectively bowed its head, and waited for answers. But answers would not come quickly. They would demand investigation, honesty, and the courage to face what many already feared: that Challenger had been doomed long before its launch. When the smoke cleared and the funerals ended, the search for answers began. The Challenger disaster was too public, too devastating, to be explained away with vague reassurances. Americans demanded the truth. Within days, President Reagan announced the creation of a special commission to investigate what had gone wrong. It was called the Rogers Commission, named after its chairman, former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The commission was more than a technical board. It was a gathering of sharp minds, powerful voices, and national icons. Among its members were astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, legendary test pilot Chuck Yeager, and most memorably, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. Their presence sent a message. This would not be a whitewash. The truth, however painful, would be pursued. When the hearings began, the atmosphere was tense. NASA leaders, already battered by public anger, faced sharp questioning. Families of the lost crew watched closely. Engineers and contractors, some of them carrying years of ignored warnings, were called to testify. What had seemed like a flawless machine was being stripped bare in the most public way possible. The commission dug deep, demanding documents, questioning managers, and interviewing engineers. Quickly, troubling patterns emerged. Reports of O-ring erosion from earlier flights. Memos from Morton Thiokol engineers raising red flags about cold weather launches. A paper trail of concerns that had been noted and dismissed. At first, NASA officials tried to frame Challenger's loss as a tragic fluke, a rare accident in an otherwise safe system. But the commission was not satisfied. Richard Feynman, blunt and unyielding, pressed for specifics. He compared NASA's culture to a house built on sand. Managers spoke of reliability in terms of 1 in 100,000 chance of failure, while engineers quietly estimated the odds at closer to 1 in 100. The gap was staggering. The public followed the hearings like a courtroom drama. Newspapers published transcripts. Evening news carried clips of testy exchanges. Slowly, the image of NASA as flawless hero began to crumble. The agency that had once carried men to the moon was now seen as bureaucratic, flawed, even careless. The Rogers Commission was not only uncovering a technical failure, it was revealing a cultural one. The disaster had not been caused by a single mistake, but by a chain of ignored warnings, managerial pressure, and the dangerous belief that the shuttle was safer than it really was. For the families of the crew, watching these revelations was painful but necessary. Their loved ones had trusted NASA with their lives. Now the truth was emerging. Trust had been misplaced. The hearings were far from over. The technical flaw would soon be demonstrated in dramatic fashion. But already one truth was clear. Challenger had not simply fallen from the sky. It had been pushed there by the weight of decisions made long before launch day. The Rogers Commission hearings gave engineers something they had long been denied: a national stage. For years, their warnings had been confined to memos, late-night meetings, and quiet frustration. Now their voices echoed in front of cameras, senators, scientists, and a grieving public. Among the most powerful was Roger Boisjoli, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Boisjoli had written a memo months before the launch, warning of disaster if the shuttle ever flew in cold weather. His words had been blunt. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. Yet that memo had been shelved, his concerns brushed aside as overly cautious. Now, sitting before the commission, he described the night of January 27th in painful detail. The heated phone calls, the desperate pleas not to launch, and the crushing moment when Thiokol executives reversed their engineer's recommendation after pressure from NASA. His testimony painted a chilling picture. The decision to fly had not been ignorance. It had been a gamble, taken against the advice of those who knew the risks best. The commission members listened intently. Families of the crew sat in silence, faces drawn tight with anger and grief. America, watching on television, realized the Challenger disaster was not a mysterious act of fate, but the consequence of human choices. Other engineers echoed Boisjoli's account. They spoke of the O-ring's history of erosion, of burn marks that had been documented and filed away after earlier flights. Each warning had been diluted as it climbed the chain of command. By the time it reached NASA managers, it was no longer a red alarm but a footnote. The phrase normalization of deviance entered the national conversation. It described the way repeated warnings, ignored after each successful flight, had become accepted as normal. Problems that should have halted launches were instead seen as tolerable risks. In this culture, Challenger's destruction was not an accident, it was inevitable. The voices of dissent revealed more than technical flaws. They exposed a system that valued schedules and appearances over safety. NASA's rush to maintain its image as flawless had silenced the very people who might have prevented disaster. For Boisjoli and others, testifying was both vindication and torment. Vindication, because their warnings were finally being heard. Torment, because they had been right. The knowledge that lives could have been saved, that Christa McAuliffe and her 6 crewmates might still be alive, was a burden that no investigation could erase. The hearings shifted tone after these testimonies. What began as a search for technical answers had become an indictment of culture and leadership. The Commission now understood. Challenger's fate had been sealed not just by rubber O-rings, but by the silencing of dissenting voices. And soon, Richard Feynman would prove to the world just how fragile those O-rings truly were, with a demonstration no one would forget. The Rogers Commission hearings were filled with charts, graphs, and technical jargon. But it took a single glass of ice water to cut through the noise. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize, winning physicist and master of plain truth, grew frustrated with NASA's evasions. He wanted the public to see, not just hear, the problem with Challenger's solid rocket boosters. During one televised session, he held up a small piece of rubber O-ring material, the very seal used in the booster joints. Calmly, he explained that these rings were designed to stay elastic, to flex under pressure and seal the joints. Then, with the eyes of the Commission and the cameras on him, he dropped the sample into a glass of ice water. Minutes passed. When he pulled the O-ring out, it was stiff, brittle, no longer springing back into shape. Feynman bent it between his fingers, showing the world how easily cold robbed it of flexibility. In those few seconds, a complex technical debate became devastatingly simple. Everyone watching could see the truth. In the freezing conditions of January 28th, the O-rings could not do their job. Feynman spoke plainly, his voice cutting through the bureaucratic fog. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. It was both a scientific observation and a moral judgment. NASA had ignored nature's warning signs, replacing them with optimism and image management. Challenger paid the price. The demonstration electrified the hearings. News broadcasts replayed it endlessly. Newspapers printed photographs of the physicist, sleeves rolled up, holding the limp O-ring above the glass. It became the defining image of the investigation, the moment when the technical mystery was stripped bare and revealed for what it was, a preventable flaw. For the families of the crew, Feynman's experiment was both vindication and agony. The tragedy was not the result of an unknowable quirk of physics. It was the result of ignored warnings about a simple piece of rubber, a weakness anyone could understand. Within NASA, the impact was shattering. Engineers had known about O-ring erosion for years, but managers had dismissed it as acceptable risk. Now, in front of the nation, the illusion of safety collapsed. The shuttle program's promise of routine, reliable spaceflight was exposed as dangerously premature. Feynman's role in the Commission became that of truth-teller, unafraid to embarrass, unafraid to challenge authority. His demonstration was more than science. It was theater timed perfectly to pierce denial. By the time he finished, there was no hiding from the conclusion. Challenger was doomed before it ever left the ground. The Rogers Commission would go on to publish hundreds of pages of findings. But in the minds of the public, it was Feynman's glass of ice water that told the story best. A simple act that revealed how a dream of progress had been undone by something as small and as fragile as a rubber ring. The Rogers Commission had shown the world the brittle truth of the O-rings, but the disaster could not be explained by rubber alone. Challenger's loss was the result of a chain of compromises, each small, each rationalized, but together forming a path to catastrophe. The shuttle itself was born of compromise. In the 1970s, NASA's budget shrank after the Apollo program. To secure funding for a new space vehicle, NASA promised everyone what they wanted. To the Air Force, it promised a craft large enough to carry military satellites. To Congress, it promised a reusable system that would cut costs. To the public, it promised frequent flights that would make space accessible. To deliver all these at once, designers had to bend physics and engineering to their limits. Those compromises showed up in every corner of the shuttle. The orbiter's fragile tiles had to cover its entire body because it would re-enter like a plane, not a capsule. The segmented boosters were built in pieces, not because it was safer, but because they needed to be shipped by rail. Even the launch schedule, dozens of flights per year, was a compromise meant to justify the program's immense cost by spreading it across missions. Inside NASA, compromise became culture. Managers knew the risks but accepted them. They learned to reinterpret failure not as danger, but as normal. When O-rings burned, they called it erosion, and treated it as manageable. When tiles fell off, they wrote it down as expected wear. When engines faltered, they called it part of routine operations. Each compromise kept the program moving forward, but also pushed it closer to disaster. The Challenger crew carried the weight of those choices. They trusted a system built on promises, unaware of how fragile those promises had become. To them, NASA was still the agency that had landed on the moon, the gold standard of safety and precision. To the public, the shuttle seemed like an airplane of the future, not a prototype flying on the edge of physics. Yet inside, some engineers knew the truth. Roger boisterously called it the slippery slope. Every time NASA flew despite warnings, every time Thiokol signed off on launches with O-ring damage, the slope grew steeper. Each success made the danger seem smaller, until the day came when all the warnings converged, and the slope ended in fire. Challenger was not destroyed by a single decision. It was destroyed by a system of compromises, stretching back years, layered one on top of another, until the machine could bear no more. The Commission began to piece together this culture of risk, exposing not just the flaw in a booster, but the flaw in an organization. The shuttle had been sold as invincible. The truth was, it had been fragile all along. And soon, the Commission would place NASA itself on trial. Not just its machines, but its very way of thinking. By the spring of 1986, the Rogers Commission had shifted its focus from hardware to culture. Challenger's O-rings had failed, yes, but the deeper failure lay in how NASA made decisions. The hearings became less about metal and rubber, and more about accountability. For the first time since Apollo, NASA, the symbol of American achievement, found itself on trial. The questions were sharp. Why had repeated warnings from engineers been ignored? Why had safety concerns been downplayed in favor of schedules? Why did NASA claim the shuttle was as safe as 1 in 100,000 when its own data suggested odds closer to 1 in 100? The Commission demanded answers, and the agency's leadership squirmed under the spotlight. William Rogers, the chairman, pressed NASA administrators to explain why engineers were not included in critical launch decisions. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space and now a commission member, pointed out that female engineers within NASA had quietly raised concerns only to be sidelined. Chuck Yeager, the legendary test pilot, questioned whether NASA had allowed politics to overrule engineering. Each question chipped away at the image of a flawless institution. For the public, this was a shock. NASA had always been a source of pride, the agency that had conquered the impossible. To see its leaders falter under questioning, to hear of meetings where managers dismissed life-and-death warnings, was almost unthinkable. The myth of perfection was breaking. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Richard Feynman. He had already captured headlines with his ice water O-ring demonstration, but he went further, accusing NASA of cultivating a culture of denial. He described the agency's management as out of touch with reality, selling a fantasy of safety that its own engineers never believed. His words were blunt. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations. It was not only a scientific judgment, it was a moral one. The Commission's findings painted a stark picture. NASA had been under immense pressure to keep shuttle launches frequent and flawless. Managers believed the program's political survival depended on it. Admitting flaws, grounding flights, or confessing uncertainty would have meant embarrassment and budget cuts. So risks were buried, language softened, and dissent muted. In the end, NASA's reputation suffered a blow far greater than any technical failure could cause. Challenger revealed that even the nation's most trusted institution was vulnerable to the same flaws as any bureaucracy: overconfidence, politics, and the silencing of inconvenient truths. For the families of the astronauts, these revelations were both vindication and heartbreak. Their loved ones had not died in a freak accident. They had died because of decisions, human decisions, that might have been different. The Commission had shown the world that Challenger's loss was preventable. Now, the spotlight turned toward the people who had tried to prevent it but were silenced. The engineers who had carried the weight of truth alone. While NASA leaders defended their decisions before the Commission, a different story emerged from the people who had lived with Challenger's flaws every day: the engineers. They were not administrators or politicians. They were men and women who spent long nights at drafting tables, running tests, combing through data. And many of them carried a burden that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Roger Boisterly became the most visible of these voices, but he was not alone. Colleagues at Morton Thiokol remembered the night before the launch as a moment of despair. They had laid out charts showing O-ring erosion at low temperatures, begged for a delay, and warned that the risks were too high. When management overruled them, some engineers went home and told their spouses they feared they would see a disaster in the morning. After Challenger's destruction, their fears were not just validated, they were immortalized in tragedy. Inside NASA, too, engineers had raised concerns. Some had noted the troubling pattern of booster erosion. Others had flagged the shuttle's fragile heat shield tiles. But their warnings often died in the machinery of bureaucracy. Managers tended to ask, "Has it failed before?" If the answer was no, the shuttle kept flying. Safety became reactive, not proactive. For the engineers, testimony before the Rogers Commission was bittersweet. They finally had an audience that listened, but at a cost measured in lives. Speaking publicly meant reliving the night they were ignored, knowing that different decisions could have saved 7 astronauts. Boisterly later admitted that testifying was the hardest thing he ever did. "I felt like I was betraying my company, but I knew I couldn't betray the crew." Many engineers retreated into the shadows after the hearings. Some left the aerospace industry altogether, unable to reconcile their work with the tragedy it had produced. Others stayed, determined to reform NASA's culture from within. They carried survivors' guilt, even though they had fought to prevent the disaster. To them, Challenger was not just a historical event. It was a personal scar. The public rarely saw their anguish. Media attention focused on the Commission, the families, and NASA's leadership. But behind the scenes, engineers grieved in quiet ways. Some wrote private journals, others gave occasional talks at schools or universities, warning future generations of the cost of ignoring data. They wanted the next wave of scientists and engineers to understand: safety is not negotiable. These were the engineers in the shadows, truth-tellers silenced until it was too late. Their story added a human dimension to the cold technical details of the Challenger disaster. They were not just professionals, they were people who had tried and failed to save lives. Their voices, once dismissed, became a moral echo in NASA's halls. And as the shuttle fleet sat grounded, the question hung heavy. Could NASA rebuild not only its technology, but the trust of the very people who had been ignored? In the months after Challenger, the launch pads at Cape Canaveral stood eerily silent. The proud shuttle fleet, Columbia, Discovery, Atlantis, was grounded indefinitely. What had once been symbols of progress now seemed like monuments to fragility. For the first time since the program's debut, America's dream of routine spaceflight was suspended. The silence was not just physical. It was cultural. NASA, once celebrated as untouchable, faced public skepticism. The agency had promised reliability, had called the shuttle operational, almost as safe as an airliner. Challenger had exposed those words as dangerously optimistic. The dream of dozens of flights per year evaporated. In its place stood doubt. Communities around the country felt the weight of that pause. Schools that had followed Christa McAuliffe's journey returned to lessons shadowed by grief. Space camps and science fairs, once buzzing with shuttle excitement, now carried somber undertones. Children still drew pictures of rockets, but often with broken plumes trailing behind. The story of inspiration had become a story of warning. Within NASA, morale plummeted. Engineers, scientists, and astronauts wrestled with guilt and uncertainty. Some questioned whether the shuttle should ever fly again. Others insisted that halting spaceflight would dishonor the crew's legacy. The debates were intense, often emotional. Could the program be saved? And more importantly, should it? The pause also carried political consequences. International partners looked at the United States with doubt. Military officials, who had planned to rely on the shuttle for satellite launches, scrambled to find alternatives. Private contractors faced financial strain as missions were canceled. The once unstoppable momentum of America's space program was suddenly fragile, dependent on whether NASA could regain trust. For the families of the Challenger crew, the pause was deeply personal. They attended memorials, gave interviews, and spoke of their loved ones with pride, but also with lingering pain. For them, the grounded fleet was not just a technical setback. It was a reminder of promises broken, warnings ignored, and lives lost unnecessarily. The Challenger disaster had frozen more than a launch schedule. It had frozen the very idea of progress. Each day the shuttle remained grounded was a day America wrestled with its own identity. Was the space program still a beacon of innovation, or had it become a reckless gamble? NASA promised reforms, but trust would take years to rebuild. In the meantime, the launch pads stood empty, ocean breezes rattling the steel towers, as if even nature were mourning. The silence became its own kind of testimony, an acknowledgement that dreams, when pursued without caution, can end in fire. Grounded, America faced its choice: to retreat from the stars, or to find a way to rise again, stronger and safer than before. NASA's survival after Challenger depended on more than repairing machines. It depended on repairing trust. The Rogers Commission had exposed not only technical flaws but cultural ones: arrogance, denial, and the silencing of dissent. To continue flying, NASA had to prove to the public, to Congress, and to its own workforce that it had changed. The work began with safety. Engineers redesigned the solid rocket boosters, focusing on the joints that had failed. The O-rings were replaced with stronger seals and heaters to keep them flexible in cold weather. The boosters themselves were reinforced, tested again and again under conditions that mimicked the Florida freeze. For the first time, engineers felt their warnings had real weight. Their voices, once muffled, became central to decision-making. Reforms stretched beyond hardware. NASA restructured its management, creating new offices dedicated solely to safety and reliability. The culture of silence, where engineers' concerns were softened or buried, was challenged. In theory, dissent was no longer a liability but a duty. Astronauts demanded more direct involvement in technical reviews, refusing to let bureaucrats be the final word on risk. But trust is not rebuilt with memos or committees. It required humility, and humility came slowly. Many in the public still doubted whether the shuttle could ever be safe. Parents who had let their children watch Christa McAuliffe's mission were wary of celebrating another launch. Even some within NASA whispered fears that the program should end altogether. To face these doubts, NASA turned to transparency. Engineers spoke openly in press conferences. Reports once hidden behind jargon were released in plainer terms. Each change was framed not as a return to glory, but as a promise never to repeat the same mistakes. Astronauts themselves played a crucial role. They visited schools, gave interviews, and reassured the public that they still believed in the shuttle. Their courage became a bridge between skepticism and hope. If the men and women willing to risk their lives believed NASA had learned, then perhaps the country could too. Still, the shadow of Challenger lingered. Every new mission plan carried the memory of the crew lost in 1986. Every delay or technical glitch sparked whispers of another disaster. The once bold narrative of spaceflight had been replaced by a more cautious one. Where NASA once promised weekly launches, now it promised only careful, deliberate ones. The path to rebuilding trust was long and uneven, but it was essential. Without it, America's presence in space might have ended with Challenger. With it, there was a chance to continue, not to erase the past, but to honor it by ensuring the same mistake would never happen again. NASA's dream of flight was still alive. But now it carried a new companion, vigilance. 2.5 years after Challenger's destruction, the launch pads at Cape Canaveral came alive once more. On September 29, 1988, the shuttle Discovery stood ready for mission STS-26. It had taken 32 months of redesigns, investigations, and soul-searching to bring the program back. For NASA, this was not just another flight, it was a trial by fire. Could America believe in the shuttle again? The build-up carried a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Families of the Challenger crew were invited to attend. For them, it was a moment of pride shadowed by grief. As one widow later said, "It felt like watching your children climb back on the horse that had just thrown them." The nation, too, was divided between hope and fear. Would history repeat itself, or would NASA prove it had learned? Discovery's mission was deliberately simple. Its job was to carry satellites, run experiments, and most importantly, come home safely. Every system had been tested and retested. Engineers monitored O-rings with obsessive care. Managers, once quick to dismiss concerns, now listened to even the faintest doubts. The launch would be the first true test of NASA's reforms. On the morning of launch, the air was thick with tension. Spectators gathered in the same viewing stands where they had once watched Challenger rise and fall. The countdown ticked forward, each second echoing with memories of January 28, 1986. At ignition, Discovery roared upward on pillars of flame. For 73 seconds, every heart clenched, every eye fixed on the sky. When the shuttle passed the moment that had doomed Challenger, a ripple of relief spread through mission control and the crowd. 8 minutes later, Discovery reached orbit. Applause thundered across NASA. Tears flowed freely. For the first time since Challenger, the shuttle had flown and survived. In orbit, the crew unfurled a banner honoring their fallen colleagues. Their mission was not only scientific but symbolic, proof that America could still reach the stars. They spoke in broadcasts about perseverance, courage, and memory. For children who had once seen Christa McAuliffe's loss, Discovery's success offered a measure of healing. When Discovery landed safely at Edwards Air Force Base in California, the relief was overwhelming. Newspapers declared, "Shuttle back in business." But it was more than business. It was a step toward restoring faith. The flight did not erase Challenger. It could never erase Challenger. But it showed that the dream of spaceflight had not died in 1986. The shuttle fleet slowly returned to service, each launch carrying both pride and ghosts. Every countdown was shadowed by Challenger's memory. Every success was measured against the price already paid. The shuttle had returned, but it would never again be seen as routine. From that day forward, every flight carried not only astronauts but the weight of history. 17 years after Challenger, the shuttle fleet once again stood at the center of national mourning. On February 1, 2003, Columbia disintegrated during re-entry, scattering debris across Texas and Louisiana. For those who remembered 1986, the loss felt like a haunting echo. 2 crews, 2 disasters bound by a common thread. Warnings ignored, risks normalized, and faith in technology stretched too far. In many ways, Columbia's fate was written in Challenger's shadow. After 1986, NASA had promised reform. Safety offices were created, engineers encouraged to speak up, and O-rings redesigned. But as years passed, pressure returned. Budgets shrank. Launch schedules grew ambitious. Managers, eager to keep the shuttle flying, began once again to accept risks as normal. The culture that had doomed Challenger quietly crept back. For Columbia, the flaw was different but familiar. During launch, a piece of foam insulation broke off the external tank and struck the orbiter's left wing. Engineers spotted the damage in videos and worried that the wing's heat shield might be compromised. But in meetings, concerns were softened, just as with the O-rings years earlier. Managers concluded it was unlikely to be serious. The shuttle was cleared to continue its mission. For 16 days, Columbia orbited the Earth. The crew conducted experiments, spoke with students, and enjoyed the view of the planet spinning beneath them. They had no idea that their ship was fatally wounded. When re-entry began, superheated gases penetrated the damaged wing, ripping the shuttle apart. Like Challenger, Columbia's crew perished not because of bad luck, but because warnings had gone unheeded. The parallels were painful. Once again, NASA had been warned. Once again, managers dismissed concerns. Once again, America watched the shuttle fleet grounded in mourning. For many, it was as though Challenger's lessons had been forgotten, buried under the pressure to keep flying. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board said it plainly. The disaster was caused not only by foam, but by NASA's culture. The very words used after Challenger, normalization of deviance, appeared again in the report. The same patterns, the same blind spots, the same tragic result. For the families of Challenger's crew, Columbia's loss reopened old wounds. They had spent years turning their grief into advocacy, urging NASA never to forget. Now they grieved alongside a new group of families, bound together by tragedy. Some asked bitterly, if NASA had truly learned from Challenger, how could Columbia have happened? The shuttle program survived Columbia, but never fully recovered. What had once been a bold vision of routine spaceflight was now a program defined as much by its losses as its triumphs. Challenger's shadow stretched across decades, a reminder that the cost of ignoring warnings is always measured in lives. Two crews 17 years apart. Two disasters linked by one truth. The heavens are unforgiving, and denial is deadly. In the aftermath of Challenger, grief could have silenced the families of the 7 lost astronauts. Instead, many of them transformed sorrow into determination. They became advocates, watchdogs, and voices that demanded NASA never again bury warnings beneath bureaucracy. Their fight stretched long beyond funerals, echoing across decades and into the tragedy of Columbia. Stephen McAuliffe, Christa's husband, carried on quietly but firmly. He rarely sought the spotlight, yet his presence reminded the nation that Christa was more than a symbol. She was a wife, a mother, a teacher. His steadiness lent weight to the push for accountability. Grace and Edward Corrigan, Christa's parents, spoke often about the importance of her dream, insisting that the Teacher in Space program should not be remembered solely for its tragedy, but for its vision of opening space to ordinary citizens. Other families also took up causes in their loved ones' names. June Scobie Rogers, widow of Commander Francis Scobie, became one of the most visible advocates. She co-founded the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, turning loss into legacy. Across the country, Challenger Learning Centers began opening, where students could conduct simulated space missions. Instead of extinguishing young people's interest in exploration, the families transformed grief into a movement to inspire the next generation. When Columbia was lost in 2003, it was these same Challenger families who reached out first. They comforted, guided, and warned the new group of grieving spouses, children, and parents. They reminded them that their voices mattered, that silence only allowed dangerous patterns to return. Together, Challenger and Columbia families formed a network of memory and vigilance. Their fight was not only emotional but political. They testified before Congress, spoke to journalists, and met with NASA officials. Some pressed for reforms in shuttle design and safety oversight. Others argued for cultural changes, urging NASA to prioritize dissenting voices. Their message was simple but powerful. These astronauts cannot speak for themselves, so we will speak for them. The Challenger families never sought to vilify space exploration. They knew better than anyone the passion and courage that had carried their loved ones to the launch pad. Their mission was not to stop spaceflight, but to ensure it honored the cost already paid. "If you ignore the past," June Scobie Rogers once said, "you risk repeating it." We refused to let their deaths be meaningless. That determination gave weight to every reform that followed. It was not just engineers and politicians who reshaped NASA after Challenger. It was also the families who refused to let the story end in silence. Their persistence left a legacy greater than grief. Through their voices, the memory of Challenger's crew lived on, not only as tragedy, but as a call to vigilance, courage, and change. When Christa McAuliffe was chosen for the Teacher in Space program, she told her students that history was not something to be read in a book. It was something they would live. Though she never returned to her classroom, her words proved true. Her legacy became larger than a single mission, rippling outward through generations of educators and students. In the immediate aftermath of Challenger, grief weighed heavily on schools across America. Children who had cheered for their teacher in space were left stunned. Their classrooms turned into places of mourning. Yet over time, Christa's story became a source of inspiration. Teachers reminded their students not only of her loss, but of her courage, her willingness to step forward, to take a place on a shuttle bound for the stars. One of the most enduring legacies was the creation of the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, founded by the families of the crew. Christa's dream of teaching from orbit did not vanish with her. Instead, it transformed. At Challenger Learning Centers across the United States and beyond, students now conduct simulated missions, learning about teamwork, science, and exploration. In each session, Christa's spirit echoes. Ordinary people can reach extraordinary heights. Her own hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, embraced her memory. Schools named in her honor, scholarships created in her name, and students encouraged to see themselves in her journey. To this day, children walk into classrooms carrying her name above the door, a reminder that learning itself is a kind of voyage. Christa's colleagues and students often spoke of her ability to make history personal. She had a gift for connecting lessons to everyday lives, for making the past feel alive. That gift did not die with her. Instead, it became a torch passed forward, inspiring generations of teachers who saw her as proof that their work could change the world. Beyond education, Christa became a symbol of the broader idea that space was for everyone. She was not an elite pilot or scientist. She was a teacher, a mother, an ordinary American who believed in the power of dreams. Her inclusion on Challenger was a statement that the frontier of space belonged not just to a select few, but to all of humanity. Though the Teacher in Space program was suspended after her death, its spirit survived in new initiatives. NASA would later send educators into orbit, each flight carrying Christa's unfulfilled promise closer to completion. Every teacher who stepped aboard a shuttle, every student who watched them fly, carried a piece of her legacy. Christa McAuliffe never delivered her lessons from space. But in another way, she taught far more than she ever planned. She taught that courage matters, that education is as vital as exploration, and that even in tragedy, inspiration can endure. Her legacy was not extinguished in fire. It lived on, in classrooms, in Challenger centers, and in the countless students who still dare to dream. History often judges disasters not only by what happened, but by what was known beforehand. Challenger was not destroyed by a hidden flaw or an unforeseeable quirk of fate. It was destroyed by warnings ignored, cautions buried, and risks rationalized until danger became routine. The story of the O-rings was the clearest example. Engineers had raised alarms for years, documenting erosion, burn marks, and the chilling effect of cold weather. They wrote memos predicting catastrophe. On the eve of launch, they pleaded for delay. Their words were not vague, they were specific, urgent, and tragically accurate. Yet managers, fearing another delay and the embarrassment it would bring, chose to override those warnings. This pattern was not unique to Challenger. Across history, great disasters often share this DNA. Not one fatal error, but a chain of smaller ones, each ignored until it was too late. The Titanic had warnings of ice ahead. Chernobyl had warnings about reactor safety. Challenger, too, had its prophets, its engineers who could see disaster coming but were powerless to stop it. The lesson was universal. Progress without caution is peril. Optimism without realism is danger. When organizations convince themselves that dissent is disloyal, they silence the very voices that could save lives. For NASA, the cost of ignoring warnings was 7 astronauts: Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe. Each carried the trust of families, friends, and a nation. Each trusted that the agency sending them skyward had listened to its own people. That trust was broken. The Rogers Commission made this point clear. The problem was not only technical, it was cultural. NASA had allowed the illusion of routine to replace the reality of risk. Managers convinced themselves that problems were acceptable. But risk does not bend to optimism. Nature does not yield to deadlines. The cold morning of January 28th proved that brutally. The cost was not only human lives. It was also the shattering of national confidence, the grounding of the shuttle program, and a scar on NASA's reputation that would never fully heal. Trust, once broken, cannot be easily restored. Yet in the aftermath, Challenger became a cautionary tale carried far beyond spaceflight. In classrooms, boardrooms, and laboratories, the story was retold. When experts warn, listen. When doubt arises, pause. The price of ignoring truth is always greater than the inconvenience of delay. Challenger's crew should have lived. The evidence was there, the warnings clear, the disaster preventable. Their loss was not fate, it was choice. And that truth became the most painful and most enduring lesson of all. In the wake of tragedy, it is easy to see astronauts as symbols, names etched into history, faces framed in photographs. But the Challenger crew were more than heroes. They were people, each carrying dreams, quirks, and stories that stretched far beyond the launch pad. To remember them only as a disaster is to forget the fullness of who they were. Francis Scobie, the commander, was a Vietnam veteran and test pilot who loved flying from the time he was a boy. Friends remembered his steady leadership, his dry humor, and his devotion to his wife, June. On launch day, he was calm, as he always was, carrying the weight of command with quiet strength. Michael Smith, the pilot, was a North Carolina native with a reputation for warmth and humility. He was the kind of man who called home just to check in, who carried pictures of his children tucked into his flight bag. His last recorded words, a quiet acknowledgement of an instrument reading, were delivered in the same calm tone that had defined his career. Judith Resnick, only the second American woman in space, was a brilliant engineer and accomplished pianist. She had grown up in Ohio, a daughter of immigrants, breaking barriers with each achievement. To colleagues, she was known for her intellect and determination. To friends, for her wit and warmth. Ronald McNair, the mission specialist, had risen from the segregated South to become a physicist and astronaut. He carried his saxophone into space on his first mission, promising to record music among the stars. He inspired countless African American students to see science as their path, proving that the sky itself was not a limit. Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American in space, was a U.S. Air Force test pilot whose life embodied quiet perseverance. He often spoke of honoring his Japanese American heritage, of proving that barriers could be broken without bitterness. His calm smile became a symbol of resilience. Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, had waded through several mission reassignments before finally earning his place on Challenger. He was an engineer with a gentle demeanor, known for his persistence and kindness. He had told friends he was simply grateful for the chance, no matter how long it took. And Christa McAuliffe, teacher, mother, dreamer. Her courage lay not in technical expertise, but in her willingness to step forward as a civilian, to embody the idea that space belonged to everyone. She wanted to return to her classroom with stories, to remind her students that history is alive. These were not just astronauts. They were fathers, daughters, sons, spouses, and friends. They laughed, worried, worked, and loved. Their human faces remind us that space exploration is never about machines alone. It is about people, their courage, their vulnerability, their willingness to risk for something greater. To honor Challenger is to remember not only the fire in the sky, but the lives that fire consumed. Decades have passed since the morning Challenger vanished in the sky, yet its story has never faded. Each retelling carries with it the same mixture of awe and sorrow, the same haunting image of white trails splitting against the blue. Challenger is more than history. It is a lesson still unfolding. The disaster teaches that progress without humility is dangerous. NASA believed the shuttle had become routine, that risks could be normalized, that deadlines could outweigh doubts. Challenger shattered that illusion. It showed that technology does not forgive arrogance, and that nature cannot be managed by optimism. The lesson remains as urgent today as it was in 1986. It also teaches the value of listening. Engineers spoke, wrote, and warned. Their voices were dismissed as inconvenient. In every field, science, medicine, engineering, politics, the story echoes. When truth is silenced, disaster follows. Challenger reminds us that dissent is not disloyalty. It is often the deepest form of care. The disaster also reminds us of resilience. From the silence that followed rose voices of families, teachers, and astronauts who refused to let the crew be remembered only for their deaths. Challenger learning centers still stand across the world, carrying Christa McAuliffe's dream into classrooms. Children who were not even born in 1986 now learn science and teamwork in her name. The crew's legacy lives not only in tragedy, but in inspiration. Challenger's story speaks to the tension at the heart of exploration, the balance between daring and caution. Humanity's greatest achievements, the moon landing, the shuttle, the International Space Station, were built on courage. But courage without vigilance becomes recklessness. Challenger's loss reminds us that exploration must carry both ambition and respect for limits. For NASA, the shuttle fleet eventually returned, and new programs were born. But Challenger and Columbia stand as permanent scars, carved into the agency's memory. Every launch since has carried those lessons in silence, a quiet reminder written into every checklist. Safety first, always. For the world beyond spaceflight, Challenger still resonates. It is invoked in leadership seminars, engineering classrooms, and even ethics courses. Its story warns against ignoring inconvenient truths, against letting pride drown out caution. It is not only a tale of a shuttle, it is a parable about the cost of human decisions. And at its heart, Challenger teaches the most human lesson of all, that dreams are precious, fragile, and worth protecting. The 7 who climbed aboard that shuttle carried the hopes of millions. Their lives, cut short, remind us that progress must honor the people who risk everything to pursue it. The sky still holds their memory. Every rocket that rises carries their story upward, a silent tribute written in flame. The Challenger disaster was not the end of a dream. It was a reminder that dreams must be guarded with vigilance, humility, and truth. Because the stars still call, and the price of ignoring the lessons of Challenger is too great to pay again. The Challenger disaster is more than a date on the calendar, more than a fiery image replayed on television screens. It is a story woven from ambition and tragedy, from brilliance and blindness, from dreams that reached too high and warnings that went unheard. For the astronauts, it was the culmination of lifetimes of dedication. They were not reckless. They trusted in the promise that the machine beneath them was safe. For the engineers, it was the nightmare they had feared, their voices silenced until it was too late. For the families, it was the sudden theft of loved ones, witnessed in full view of the world. And for a nation, it was a moment when the future itself seemed to falter. But Challenger's legacy did not end in fire. Out of grief came resolve. Out of silence came voices that demanded change. Out of loss came learning, reforms, and a renewed insistence that safety must never be sacrificed to schedule or pride. The Challenger Learning Centers, the memorials, the scholarships, all stand as proof that memory can be transformed into action and tragedy into teaching. Still, the echoes of Challenger remain. When Columbia was lost in 2003, those echoes became deafening. The lessons of Challenger had been remembered in words, but forgotten in practice. Again, the price was paid in lives. And again, the truth was clear. When warnings are ignored, the cost is unbearable. Today, spaceflight continues. On rockets that carry astronauts to the International Space Station, on missions that peer deeper into the universe than ever before. Each success is built not only on engineering but on remembrance. Challenger is not simply in the past. It is present in every checklist, every review board, every decision where safety stands against ambition. The Challenger crew are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived, for their courage, their curiosity, their willingness to carry humanity's dreams. They remind us that progress is not measured only by distance traveled or missions completed, but by the care with which we honor those who take the journey. In the end, Challenger teaches that exploration is both a gift and a responsibility. To reach for the stars is to carry the weight of vigilance, humility, and truth. It is to remember that even the greatest dream must bow to the realities of nature. On that cold morning in January 1986, 7 lives were lost. But their story continues, in classrooms, in space centers, in every rocket that climbs skyward. Challenger endures not only as a tragedy, but as a warning and as a beacon. And in the silence that followed the fire, one truth remains. The stars still call, but we must listen to the warnings of Earth before we dare to answer.